Hello there and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I've got another inexpensive graphics card to check out in some modern games. I know I've been testing a few of these recently, but I've been really enjoying testing them, and you all seem to enjoy watching me test them, so let's do another. Today, I'm going to be looking at a card that tends to live in the $45 to $55 price point on eBay most days of the week, and that I think might be one of the best cards available for gaming at this price point. This is the GTX 980, and I bought mine for $50 on eBay. This card came out in 2014 and is a member of Nvidia's Maxwell 2.0 architecture cards. It's got 4GB of GDDR5 VRAM on a 256-bit bus and a TDP of 165 watts. Now, before I get a swarm of comments screaming at me, RX 580, RX 580, RX 580, what about the RX 580? Yes, I know the RX 580 exists. However, I wanted to take a bit of a different approach to the $45 to $55 GPU than everyone else has, because basically everyone else has talked about the RX 580, and I think checking out a different option might be kind of refreshing. According to Tech Power Up, it seems that the RX 580 and the GTX 980 should perform very similarly, meaning that the only big downside to the 980 versus a 580 would be the extra VRAM that you can get on a 580. Though I have noticed that these 8GB RX 580s seem to go for a little bit more than the 980s, which is worth keeping in mind, I guess. In any case, let's get started with the testing for this graphics card. I'll start with the test system that I'm going to be running it in, as well as the maintenance that I've done for this card, as I did go ahead and repaste it and replace the thermal pads on the memory chips due to it being an 11-year-old card. Then I'll be testing this video card in the Dell Precision 3630 system that you've probably seen in one of my recent videos. This system has an Intel Core i7-8700 in it, paired with 32GB of DDR4 RAM. Also worth noting, I am running throttle stop on this system just to increase the turbo power limit time duration in order to improve CPU performance, as this will allow me to best represent this GPU's performance without introducing any CPU limitations. So with that out of the way, let's get into some games. I've tested this card in the exact same suite of games as I used in my Precision 3630 sub $500 gaming PC video, but for those of you who didn't see that one, I'll be testing it in Minecraft with and without shaders, Fortnite, Valorant, Forza Horizon 5, Spider-Man Remastered, Halo Infinite, Satisfactory, Far Cry 6, and The Last of Us Part 1. And as for my testing methodology, instead of aiming for a certain preset in all of these games and seeing what the card is able to do, for example, running every game at high settings and seeing what we get, I'll instead be choosing the preset that seems to get us as close to a good, playable FPS as possible at native 1080p. Starting out with Minecraft 1.21.10 without shaders, running the default graphics settings with a 16 chunk render distance and 12 chunk simulation distance, this card unsurprisingly shredded this game. The average frame rate was 307 FPS with a 1% low of 19.5 and a 0.1% low of 7.7, both of which seem to stem from the fact that modern Minecraft is so unbelievably stuttery when generating new chunks, meaning that I wouldn't blame the card for these lows. Heck, I saw a similar performance on a 3070 in the same system in this game. When turning on complementary reimagined shaders on the high preset, while using the most recent official Optifine release, which is 1.21.4, this GPU was able to put out an average frame rate of 54 FPS, which is completely serviceable for Minecraft, and honestly, really impressive for $50. The percentile lows were 28 FPS for the 1% low and 16.7 FPS for the 0.1% low. Moving on to Fortnite, in DirectX 12 with high settings, this system managed an average frame rate of 67.3 FPS with a 1% low of 41.6 and a 0.1% low of 7.2. So, yet again, a pretty darn great performance, especially for $50, and I expect that if you were to switch into something like performance mode, you could get a very high frame rate out of this card. In Valorant now, with mostly medium settings, this card ran at an average frame rate of 274.4 FPS with 149.5 FPS and 62.9 FPS as the 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. Honestly, if you wanted to, there's absolutely room to crank the settings up to high here and still get get a great performance. However, I know that Valorant players want a very high frame rate to reduce latency, and it's great to see that this card is more than capable of doing that without having to drop all the way down to the minimum settings. On into the first AAA title of today's video, let's check out how this card did in Forza Horizon 5. I chose a preset that got as close to an average of 60 frames per second as possible because that's what I believe is a nice, playable frame rate in this game. That turned out to be the medium preset, where this card was able to get an average frame rate of 60.2 FPS with a 1% low of 47.9 FPS and a 0.1% low of 46.3. So it was also a very stable and smooth performance, which is always nice to see. In the next AAA title, Spider-Man Remastered, this card got close to 60 FPS as an average at the medium preset again, and it managed to put out an average frame rate of 62.4 FPS with a 1% and 0.1% low of 35.7 and 25.1 FPS respectively. The performance in this game was, overall, more than sufficient to play with, considering that this game does have some pretty fast-paced fight movements where a higher frame rate is appreciated. Now, this card has been performing very well so far, and I'm honestly super impressed with it, considering that's an 11-year-old GPU. However, not every game was sunshine and rainbows, and it's time to talk about the one game that wasn't playable on this card, and that is Halo Infinite. This game, even at the very lowest preset and the lowest resolution scale, while having a perfectly usable average frame rate of 45.9 FPS, it was an incredibly unstable frame rate and therefore unplayable. These big hitches made aiming really hard at times, and overall, the game was not just unfun to play, it was also just difficult to do well in due to this system's performance. Now, while Halo Infinite does appreciate more VRAM, I've run this game perfectly fine on a laptop with a 4GB GTX 1650 Ti in it at the low preset before, so there must be something else affecting this performance other than VRAM capacity. The percentile lows do not accurately portray how unplayable this game was, but still, here they are. The 1% low was 21.1 FPS, and the 0.1% low was 18. Moving on from that quite disappointing performance, let's check out Satisfactory. Here, this card managed an average frame rate of 54.2 FPS at the medium preset. The 1% low was 32.8 FPS, and the 0.1% low was 3.5. Which are pretty normal lows for this game, as it can sometimes be quite stuttery. Overall, this was a great performance in this game, as due to it being a factory building sandbox game, 50 to 60 FPS is more than sufficient. Next, I tested Far Cry 6, and at the medium preset, this card got an average frame rate of 56.8 FPS, with a 1% low of 45.8 and a 0.1% low of 39.6. While this isn't quite 60 FPS, it's still a very usable frame rate in this game. However, if you're craving a bit of a higher frame rate, due to it being a fast-paced shooter game, you could run it at the low preset, which still looks alright, and this allowed the card to get an average frame rate of 70.5 FPS. The final and heaviest game for today's tests was The Last of Us Part 1, which I ran at the low preset, mostly due to the VRAM meter in the settings menu. I do fear that in this title, 4GB of VRAM is going to hurt a lot, but let's see if we can get a usable frame rate. At the low preset, this card managed an average frame rate of 46.6 FPS, and the 1% low was 31, with a 0.1% low of 22.5. While this card wasn't capable of a 60 FPS average at 1080p native, 46 FPS is still usable in this title, because most of the time, it's not stupidly fast-paced, unlike something like Far Cry. And that concludes all of the benchmarks that I'm running today. I tried to cover a decently wide variety of games, and I also wanted to include a large number of more recent AAA titles. This is because it's basically a given that this card, being a nearly flagship card of its time, will be able to play Minecraft, Valorant, and Fortnite just fine. However, harder to run games such as Far Cry, Forza, and The Last of Us are a lot more interesting to test, as it's not necessarily a given on whether or not this card can handle these games. One thing that I would like to mention at this point that I was honestly somewhat surprised about is that the GTX 980 experienced no compatibility issues in regard to drivers or DirectX feature sets. Something important to keep in mind when comparing the GTX 980 to the RX 580 is that the RX 580 only supports DirectX 12.0, which is a more limited feature set than the DirectX 12.1 feature set supported by the GTX 980. This newer feature set brings efficiency improvements to the GTX 980, and it also enables it to run some games that have come out recently, which the 580 can't even launch due to it not supporting this feature set. But Theoretically, the 980 could actually launch these games. So what's my final verdict on the GTX 980 in 2025? Well, I was thoroughly impressed with its performance in every single game except for Halo Infinite. I'm not sure what was happening with the performance in Halo, but it wasn't usable at any settings because of how inconsistent the frame pacing was, which was a major disappointment. Looking outside of Halo though, I was really impressed with the level of performance that can be had for $45 to $55 with this card. It does stand up against some pretty stiff competition near to its price point, that being the RX 580 8GB, which has double the VRAM of the 980, but considering that the 980 sometimes shows up for significantly cheaper than the 8GB RX 580s, and that it was still able to get some great performance while also supporting a newer DirectX feature set, I think that it's a very solid option for someone shopping around this price point. Well, that's all that I have for you in today's video. I hope that you were able to at least enjoy it and maybe even learn a thing or two. In any case, I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.